What inspired you to take this stage?
So I had been working in Silicon Valley for a little while at that point, in 2013, which is when I set up the database. And being in kind of that startup ecosystem, I just tended to know who the other female engineers were. And being in Palo Alto, I would go chat with the engineers of different companies. And in the back of my head, I was tracking, like, this startup has like these 2 female engineers, this startup has these 2. Dropbox got up to 40 engineers before they hired their first female. So I was tracking these things in my head. But then I realized that nobody else really had any of these numbers. And it all kind of came together at this one point when I was at Grace Hopper, which is a really big conference for women in computing. And I was at a breakfast with Sheryl Sandberg, who's a big group breakfast. And she was at the front of the room talking about how the numbers are dropping precipitously for women in tech. And while I didn't disagree with her sentiment necessarily, I just wondered what numbers she was referring to, because to my knowledge, nobody had these numbers. She might have been talking about Facebook, but I don't think she was just talking about Facebook. And that irony struck me of how everything in tech is so data-driven. And being on the engineering side and having set up numerous event logging and data logging systems as well, and like having helped build these dashboards of metrics and looking at metrics every single day and running A/B tests, like everything was so metrics driven, and realizing that we had no numbers at all for diversity just felt very wrong. So that was why I set up a database and a call to action, although I honestly didn't expect much response. I also understood the reasons why people didn't want to talk about their numbers, because they look bad. And there is this thing kind of like competitively with different companies that wanted to all pretend that they were doing better than average. Not everybody can be doing better than average, but everybody wants to pretend that they're doing better than average in terms of diversity. And so when there were no actual numbers out there, people could all say that they were doing well, and then they would try to attract more women. And there was thought to be maybe that's like the virtuous cycle you can build to attract more gender diversity at least. But it felt a little bit disingenuous that we didn't actually have numbers. And it was frustrating to me that I could talk to all these different companies about what efforts they had in place, and I would hear all these different cool things that people were doing, whether it was extended maternity leave or other benefits or other programs and different efforts that they were supporting, but there was no success metric attached to those. So I couldn't necessarily go to Pinterest, which was my employer then, and say we should do these things that other companies are doing, because I couldn't say that they were effective or not. I wanted to recommend that we have better maternity leave, but I couldn't justify it with any numbers. I could just say, I know that Facebook and Google are doing this thing, but who knows if it's successful.
Hi, what are some ways that what are some ways companies can improve diversity in the recruiting process? It's
a pretty broad question. So the first thing is I'll plug Project Include. So projectinclude.org has a lot of recommendations. The 8 of us wrote down 87 different recommendations, and there are a lot around hiring, so that will go into much more depth. But very broadly speaking, around hiring, the first thing I would do is actually just set up metrics so you understand how many people are applying, how many people make it to the phone screens, how many people are making it through each step of the process, and understanding the demographics there. And that will identify for you where your funnel might be broken. A lot of companies will struggle getting diversity in the candidate pools, which is the very top of the funnel. And some of that has to do with relying very heavily on referrals, where referrals are often very homogenous. They reflect the social networks of people who already work at the company. Those just tend to be very homogenous. So relying too heavily on referrals tends to skew you in one way. And then to counteract that, you may have to just try a lot harder to go to events and networks that are less demographically, or they're more demographically diverse and not as similar to your existing cohort. And then some of that is just putting a lot more effort into sourcing on LinkedIn and just trying really hard to get people interested. There are some things around making sure your job postings are good. There's a lot of research around the number of requirements and how you frame them, the kind of wording you use. So there's also software out there to help you reduce bias. And so some of the software out there can flag words that are more gender skewed. So there's more male gender terms, like if you talk about rock star programmers, hackers, and we work really hard all the time, we're really hardcore, it tends to deter women. There's also really interesting research that says when you have these job postings that you've crafted to be more gender neutral, and so some of that is adding in the terms that skew more female friendly. Those are things like collaborative, and you talk about teamwork. It not only increases your percentage of female applicants, but it increases your applications from ethnically diverse backgrounds. And so the hypothesis there is that if you're like a black person, you look at this job posting and it sounds like some white frat bros want to like recreate their frat house, you're not very interested in joining. But if it seems to be a very inclusive environment, even if it's just inclusive of other genders and even from different ethnicities, you may find that you may feel that you would belong better in that environment. Then past that, there's all the actual hiring bits of it, the interview process. A lot of interview processes are very biased. Before the last couple of years at Pinterest even, when I did interviews, I was just instructed to go into the room and come out with a yes or no. But that's just like all bias. If you go in and say you like the person or not, and we're roughly instructed to gauge them on their technical ability, but there's so much skew in that we didn't have any standard rubrics, we didn't know exactly what we were looking for. So the best practice there is for your job recs to write down exactly what you're looking for, which things matter, and you'll find that many of the things that we implicitly making matter don't really matter, like the school or prior experience. If you're trying to hire a really good engineer, does it actually matter if they went to a top-tier university? That doesn't actually have a bearing on their job, so if it doesn't, then stop giving plus points to people on that. And there are ways, even in debriefs of candidates, where you can highlight or not those sorts of characteristics. We noticed one thing that we were doing at Pinterest was, even though we said we didn't care about the pedigree or the university or prior employers that people had, we'd always lead off debriefs with, oh, this candidate who now works at this place and previously worked at these really prestigious companies and went to school at these places, we're going to talk about them now. But if you always lead off with these things that actually don't matter, that already is skewing people's perceptions. But with a much more standard and structured rubric, you can start to mitigate that bias. And then you're very clear about what you're looking for. This can be even more important when you're looking at things like culture fit. And also reframing that in terms of maybe culture add as opposed to culture fit. Like you want to add people to your team that are going to be, adding new dimensions to your perspectives and contributing more, not just like do they already fit the mold of who's already there. But if you have company values, for example, that you've written down, then you can assess people against those company values. And those company values are not like, do I want to hang out with this person Sunday night and play beer pong with them in the office? There are things like, it may be how risk seeking are they, or how collaborative are they? There's like these values that your company has actually explicitly said are important, then you can assess against those. There's probably more on the website that I missed. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm not sure if you saw the journal piece together about Palantir. Thank you. But, basically they're being audited by the FCCP because the gist is they have these huge software engineer pools that are 80% Asian, they're hiring 20% out of them, so it's a big problem. I think it's a good reminder, a lot of Silicon Valley companies are federal contractors, so it's not just a question of culture, but it's also a legislative question. I was wondering what you thought about maybe the efficacy of current legislative solutions, diversity issues, and if there's a need for more solutions like that coming from the law and not just from nonprofits and general culture.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I did see that case, and I had a lot of thoughts about it, and I haven't quite boiled down like what my stance is on it. So just like as a brief recap, the Department of Labor is suing Palantir, or has a case against Palantir for discriminating against Asians, specifically in software engineering roles. And because Palantir is a federal contractor, like it is actually relevant. I think the law can really push us further than companies would be willing to go otherwise, and maybe that's around disclosure of data. The concerns I have are how to construct the legislation correctly. So even in this case with Palantir, it was a little bit unclear to me, like if I had a pro or con stance, or I didn't know exactly how I should feel about the fact that they were reducing the numbers of Asians. So if you think about it from a diversity angle, if you have 80% Asian, that's also not very diverse. And so one potential argument would be like we want to do something similar to what universities are doing and ensure diversity in our college classes because that makes for a stronger class. And so then, like, what is the appropriate percentage match from in the application pool to the actual hired? It's not totally clear what that should be. So there's these questions that are similar to the affirmative action questions for universities, like what is the right thing to do? And even if so, we should talk about affirmative action as an analogy. Even scholars like Michelle Alexander, who does a lot of work around the Black communities, is not a fan of affirmative action for universities because it can be viewed as a way of masking the problems that you have, because you can say our representation is really good at these like top tier universities when there are actually more systemic issues at play. And quotas can be very dangerous culturally because people then may view the people who are coming in as these underrepresented groups as being not as good. And so then that can perpetuate some of the stereotypes. So there's a lot of those sorts of questions which are difficult to say for sure like legislation would help or not.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, affirmative mismatch is a great book if anyone's interested in it, but about affirmative action, one of the big problems they have is you underrepresented minorities come in with maybe less preparation, and as a result, they drop out of STEM majors for more, which are higher paying, and drop out of school at a higher rate. There's probably a similar analogy to them dropping out of the workforce in tech to really have to learn it's complicated.
Yeah, like I've had this experience where I've talked to people who've like tried really hard to hire more female engineers, but then they were talking about should we lower the bar for female engineers? Like no, don't hire people that aren't qualified for the job, because that also will hurt people like me who are actually legitimately in my job, and now I feel like everybody's gonna look at me as if I just barely got in because I'm female. And I actually already started to feel some of that in certain environments. People are like, oh, you only got this because you're a woman, they need more women. And so it hurts people who are already in the field. It doesn't help the stereotype. It doesn't help to mitigate those stereotypes, and it just actually perpetuates them. So yeah, it's complicated, and I still haven't quite figured out my feelings on it.
No, thanks. I appreciate that.
I've spoken to, I don't know what it's like over here, as you can probably tell from the UK, but in London, there's a perception among particularly early stage startups where in order to properly invest in solving all the diversity challenges that exist, you need a lot of resources. And so when people are concerned about their runway already, they sort of put it off and put it off and put it off. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. And what would you say to them to kind of convince them that actually, because I'm not sure it even does necessarily require financial resources, I guess it's more the time. But how would you kind of encourage them to stop putting it off?
Yeah, I would say it is that very, very short-term trade-off against like a slightly longer-term benefits. So when you hire a bunch of people who are all very similar, you might be able to get some of the immediate tasks done, but your longer-term vision may be totally off, or your operating just may be much more, you may have these blind spots. And so it is that commitment to building a team that's going to be strong in a few months and maybe holding off on hiring that person tomorrow. We, as Project Include, actually just released a post that was talking about how we had a lot of diversity on our early team, and we were pretty deliberate about it as well. And as like a startup nonprofit, we had to think about who are we going to bring into our team to make sure that we have a diverse group, and how do we operate efficiently. So one other criticism I've heard of hiring diversity early on is that if you have people who come from very different backgrounds, then it may be more challenging to move quickly if people have different opinions and aren't aligned necessarily. And I think Peter Thiel advocates for this in 0 to 1, like, oh yeah, just like hire a bunch of people who are all the same, and you can move faster in the early days. Peter Thiel is also one of the co-founders of Palantir. Maybe not a coincidence. But we found that as a more diverse group amongst Project Include, we're so much stronger for having all the different perspectives represented with people who had been in entrepreneur roles, investor roles, and founders of diversity startups, founders of like software companies, engineers. We had all these different perspectives represented, people who were a little bit older, who were younger, who had kids, no kids. One person in our group came as an undocumented immigrant. And then there's a few of us who are the children of immigrants that came under skilled, like very highly skilled labor type of immigration. So just having all these different perspectives made our output so much better. But we had to be also very thoughtful about how we designed the culture and how we made decisions. So we had to come to an agreement about how we operated as a group. So we don't have to agree 100% on everything in order to make progress, because we're never going to agree 100% on things. And so there are some challenges in making sure that diversity will work at a very early stage, but it tends to be so much better for your product. So if people are worried about maybe being out of business in 3 months, and they make all these trade-offs that then ensure that they're out of business in 6 months, it doesn't really seem to be that much better. And so it's just kind of framing that trade-off correctly.
Well, yeah, you can go. No, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Trinity. I was wondering, you work for Pinterest. I was wondering, how was the scaling in terms of Pinterest for that company? It scaled drastically within 1 year in terms of having their user base. Mm-hmm. So how did that help with, in terms of, I guess, developing that site, or how did that affect the news?
Yeah, are you asking on the cultural side of how to scale, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I joined Pinterest when it was about 10 employees, and I left in June 4.5 years later when it was 1,000, so I saw it grow a couple of orders of magnitude. I think the thing that was really important about scaling the company and the culture was that Ben, who's the CEO and founder, was very, very deliberate about culture from very early on. That was one of the things that drew me to Pinterest. Even when I was talking to him, there were only 8 people at the company, and even at that point he was saying, I want to build a type of company where people will be proud to have worked here 20 or 30 years from now. And because he was so deliberate about that, in those early days when they were hiring, his time was less valuable, even though he was like leaving the company. His time was less valuable than engineering time. And so even for engineers, we would do the culture interview first. If they didn't pass culture, they wouldn't even go to the technical screens, which is pretty unusual. That was in the early days, obviously, but it is an example that shows how important culture was to Ben. And pretty early, we wrote down our values and were very explicit about what type of culture we wanted to build. And so even though we scaled very quickly, we had alignment around the cultural values. And I would say even though the company grew a ton, and there are things that obviously change when your scale is so different, the sort of like top line adjectives I would use to describe the culture were consistent from when it was 10 people to when it was 1,000. So I think that was pretty critical. And I don't know if you're interested in hearing about like the rest of the engineering scaling, but that was just...
Oh yeah, I am.
Yeah. Well, basically it's always a shit show, and everything is always falling apart, and you have like postmortems like every day for the site being down. That's pretty much it. But you hire good people and just keep rebuilding. It is one of those very classic stories of you have your current architecture, which you know is not going to support the user base in a couple of weeks, and you just like are building out the next big thing. So you figure out like I need to do 2x current or 5x or 10x and start building it. By the time you get to that milestone, you're building. Then you like start building for the next. When I first joined, we were in the middle of a big database migration because we didn't have enough IDs to hand out for pins. So within 2 or 3 weeks, we wouldn't have been able to create any more pins because there was no more ID space for pins. So that was like a frantic database migration for that. We were just doing that we fixed that issue, so we didn't have to do that anymore. But it was pretty constantly that sort of thing where, we're constantly trying to figure out how to scale up our infrastructure to like some order of magnitude greater. Yeah.
And when you guys set that restriction, let's say for instance for the pins, how did you know not to set a restriction, or you guys set a limit for the restriction?
It wasn't that deliberate. It was just like we didn't think about it, and then we ran into issues. Yeah. So I think this is another example of like early on you make a bunch of these decisions that you don't think matter, and then they actually do really matter, and they're very problematic to fix. I think it's a good analogy to the diversity issues where you don't think about them early on, then you get to a point where you're like, holy crap, like we are really screwed, and like how do we fix this? How do we dig ourselves out? Like how do we get out of this hole? And yeah, that was just a poor decision early on to use 32-bit integers for IDs, and it wasn't good enough. Yeah.
I have a question. So you see a lot of these established VC firms now bringing in more minorities
younger people just have more diverse opinions. That seems to me like a safe way and baby steps forward. I just wonder what in your best and optimal world you'd like to see that you really think would equalize the playing field in the VC and funding world for everyone's startups.
Yeah, so in the VC world, it's even less diverse than in tech, right? I think it's, depending on what cut you're looking at, it's 6% of senior investment partners at U.S. VC firms that have raised at least $100 million in capital since 2009 are female. So we're now conditioning on the slightly larger firms. There's a higher percentage of female investment partners if you look at the smaller firms. So there's starting to be more female partners that are spinning out their larger firms and starting their own. But it's really hard for women and minorities, and the stats for minorities are even worse. 1.5% Black in these senior investment roles and less than 1% Hispanic. So it's pretty awful at these very large firms. And you're starting to see more diversity in the smaller firms, but they also have less capital to deploy. I think what I would like to see is for these bigger firms to be a little bit more committed to increasing diversity in their ranks, because they're the ones that are controlling hundreds of millions or even billions in capital. And a lot of the argument back is often like, well, it takes a long time for somebody to become a partner, and the pipeline is not there. But actually, there's a lot of ways for people to become partners. So it does mean that the pipeline can be much more diverse. It doesn't have to just be people who have exited companies. One thing that could be an interesting way for VC firms to tap into a more broad base of investors is through their scout programs. So Sequoia runs a scout program where they have, it was written about in the Wall Street Journal, I think they had like 78 or so scouts. So they were just taking some capital from Sequoia. They wouldn't identify the capital as being from Sequoia, but they would put investments into probably just companies that they had encountered through their networks. The scout programs are not necessarily, they're relatively low commitment. So you can have a lot of scouts, they come from different backgrounds, they don't need prior investment experience, and the stakes are relatively low. But it's a good chance for more people to be empowered to be making those investment decisions, and if any of them are doing really well, then now you have a great pool, a great candidate pool of people to potentially hire on full time. But Sequoia's scout program, out of 78, they only had 5 female scouts, and one of them was a daughter of a managing partner there. So they're really just not trying very hard on this front. I think these firms, if they're willing to run these programs, they can try a lot harder to diversify their ranks and just be more thoughtful about when they do make these promotion decisions for people to become partners, have they really considered everyone that's available, or are they just, again, leaning on their social networks, which tend to be pretty homogenous?
Do you have any recommendations for youth educational programs to help create diversity from earlier on, just like ways to empower younger women to aspire to roles and stuff?
Yeah, I haven't spent as much time looking into the younger demographic. I do know of a few pretty cool efforts. One is code.org, and so that's not specifically focused on girls, but their tactic is let's get CS education into K through 12, and so if it's mandatory for every student to take, then it's no longer biased because girls and boys are taking the CS classes, and people of all different ethnic backgrounds are doing it as well, so it's no longer an elective. And so that's like their covert way of increasing diversity. There are also programs that specifically support girls, like Girls Who Code. We'll run these like summer programs and have them hosted at companies, like in the Bay Area, like Square and Twitter were host companies. It was kind of cool for these girls to be able to go in. I mean, they're not like working on the code bases at Twitter or Square, but they get to be in that environment, and they also get to take these field trips to other tech companies and see what it's like to be in the tech world, at least like that physical space. It was really fun for us to host the Girls Who Code class for field trip at Pinterest. They came in, they were like, wow, it's so, I didn't realize that working in tech was so cool. There's like free food, they were grading our kitchens, we had stickers and notebooks for them, and they were so excited. Those little things, which are actually totally not germane to the job, like they can still get people excited. And then to have role models in front of them, to have like women that looked like them, like maybe 10 years older than them, was pretty powerful, and they could start to imagine themselves in that. I know some people who are working on efforts more from the media side, And so just trying to get more girls represented in popular media, whether that's very mainstream like TV or through new channels like Snapchat or Instagram. So there's a lot of these different angles. When it's cultural change, you have to affect it through all these different ways, and not just in school, it's also through who these people are seeing on YouTube and Instagram. Yeah.
Thank you. In the scenario that you mentioned where a company has gone to a large state but they didn't think about diversity early and then it gets to a point, oh gosh, we need to go backtrack, right?
Yeah.
What advice do you have for somebody within the organization that is a diverse candidate? Culture stems from the top.
Mm-hmm.
How do you safely bring up that conversation so that leadership will recognize that and really be champions behind diversity in tech?
The hard answer to that question is that there may be no safe way. In some cases, it's very context dependent. And it's definitely possible that if the company is not supportive of diversity from the top down, then there's no way to change the opinions of those people at the top. And I've heard and experienced horror stories of people who are trying to flag these issues to leadership and were just very unsuccessful. And then it starts to be this question of like, how do you even frame these arguments? And I think there's like some stuff to be learned from like civil rights movements and previous like social movements and also politics around like how do you get people onto your side. People who are very staunchly on the other side and really don't believe in diversity, you may not be able to convince them ever, but there may be people in the middle, more undecided, that you can convince. And for some people, it's the moral and social justice arguments that make more sense, and for others, maybe more the business side. I think it's going to be different for all these different undecideds, how you're going to get them over. So I don't think there's like any one safe way to advocate.
We're going to do 2 more questions and then a final statement. So if you have a question, now's your chance.
Well, hi, I'm Maida, and we create content for the Hispanic camps, and we have a different scenario where all our team is Hispanic, and we're trying to integrate different cultures and all, but it's it's challenging for the person that comes, the outsider. They come into the room, it's all this Mexican speaking soccer, and they're like, I don't really fit in. So what's your advice into welcoming other cultures and like really don't be afraid, we're just going to spicy food.
Yeah, it's a very similar problem to the diversity issues that other companies have, but you just have a different starting cohort, right? So I think very similar advice applies. Try to make sure that you are inclusive of people from different backgrounds. You don't have a lot of assumptions around the types of people that would fit in. If you feel like they may be uncomfortable in certain situations, like just try to mitigate those factors. But yeah, it is funny. I've talked to people who are very proud, for example, that their engineering team is all female. Like, well, that's not diverse either. You're just not diverse in the other direction. And like, good luck bringing on your male developers if they don't feel like they can fit in your all-female environment, right? So I think it's pretty standard advice around trying to build diversity. Like if you're trying to hire more people, you're not finding that they're interested in coming, then just sourcing really hard, trying to adjust these aspects of your culture that might be off-putting. If they're not necessary to your culture and they're kind of incidentally there and are off-putting to people from different backgrounds, like try to correct for those. Try to be very deliberate about making people feel welcome when they come in, set them up to succeed. Try not to do things that are unnecessarily exclusionary. So a lot of times, like for smaller teams especially, you'll have like information exchange through like more social ways. You might just go hang out after work, and important information gets disseminated in these like after work hours. But if you're not socially part of those groups, like for me, it was very difficult to go hang out with the guys and get beers after work because I just didn't enjoy it. Then I'd miss out on a bunch of information that was being exchanged. If you have those sorts of things happening, try to cut back on those, or try to make sure all the important stuff is happening during work hours in a much more structured environment so everybody has equal access. But yeah, I think it's the standard advice. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of what it is you're explaining, from your deal quote to stuff in the job description, is essentially people trying to hire their friends, like people who will be their friends, not just colleagues, which definitely fits with my experience as well. you know, a lot of, I feel like what people say when they're looking for cultural fit is that. You also spoke pretty positively of the cultural fit interview being at the front of Pinterest interviews. So I'm curious, what is it you were looking for? Because I feel like just 90% of what I've seen in culture fit that people are looking for in the past is like, can I hang out with this person? Which I agree is not a good measure.
So what we did with the culture interviews at Pinterest, which we also didn't call culture fit because we didn't want it to be like fitting people into a mold, was that we had our company values. And so the company values for Pinterest were put pinners first. It's a very big focus on the end users of our products and thinking from their perspective. We talked about the authentic, so being very genuine and open with each other. Knit, which was around being collaborative and recognizing that really cool things happen when people from different disciplines can collaborate and knit together. And our last one was go, so like a propensity towards action instead of just ruminating and thinking too long before trying something out. So we had these very explicit values that we cared about. It's like, does this person fit into this more collaborative environment where they really put an emphasis on the end user? Those are the cultural values that we cared about, not the do I want to hang out with them.
How did you suss that out then?
So we have very specific questions for these different cultural areas, and there are actually firms that specialize in constructing these questions and testing them and making sure that they can. And we ended up bringing on a consulting firm called Corn Ferry, strangest name. It's not. It was spelled differently than you're imagining, but they actually had like books and books of questions that they had vetted and done research on to assess these sorts of like cultural characteristics. And some of them are situational, some of them are behavioral questions, like what would you do if you were posed with this situation, and some of them were what have you done in the past when you had this sort of situation. But they actually have like research-backed questions to assess these characteristics. So it's not just like, do I want to hang with you?
Yeah.
All right, Tracy, any last statements?
Why for the show for Project Include? ProjectInclude.org has a lot of resources. We put down 87 different recommendations, so it's a lot. But I think everything that we could think of that was important is distilled there, and there's a lot of other resources linked from our site. So if you're curious to keep learning more about what you can do around diversity and inclusion in your companies, hopefully that can be a good resource to you.
There it is.